Neither shall you touch it, lest you die. I believe the serpent's work of sowing seeds of resentment is already beginning to manifest itself in Eve. God actually did not say, don't touch the fruit. But Eve has begun in her mind, slowly but surely, to add to what God said, and thereby to maintain some sense of God's unreasonableness in giving them this command. She does affirm that this is for their protection, lest you die. The serpent, though, he swiftly changes gears from sowing seeds of resentment and doubt to complete denial. He says, you will not surely die. In other words, he's calling God a liar. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And the woman does not check that at all. She doesn't push back. She doesn't really respond, other than to look more intently at the fruit itself. We're told that she saw that it was good for food. So what she saw attracted her. She saw that it was a delight to the eyes. She saw that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. And so she took of its fruit and she ate. In other words, a combination of visual and feeling combined in the spirit of Eve to cause her to rebel against God's very simple, very straightforward command. And then there's Adam. Where's he in all of this? He seems to be just hanging out. She also gave some to her husband who was with her. And he ate. And the eyes of both were open, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and they made themselves loincloths. Then fast forward later, God's calling out for them, and God sees them, and they see God, and they're talking to each other, and Adam is, of course, head of his household. He's the one that God speaks to first, and Adam blames the woman. He doesn't even call his wife by her name. The woman that you gave to me. So actually, he's not even blaming the woman, he's blaming God. It's either the woman's fault or it's God's fault, but it's not my fault. I've not done anything wrong. The Lord says to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman points at the creature. Oh, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So suddenly she becomes very vulnerable and very undiscerning and just very helpless, a victim in all of this. And so God doesn't ask the serpent anything. He knows what he's on about. And directs a curse upon the serpent. It culminates with these words in verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Of course, the woman will have multiplied pain in childbearing. She will have desires that the text says are contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. So the woman is fighting against her husband. The woman is fighting against the man, and she thinks differently from him. She feels differently from him. Her desires are contrary, in fact, to his, and yet still he rules over her. And that really wasn't the ruling over you aspect was not how God set things up. They were working together in the garden. Yes, Eve had, from the beginning, from creation, there have been roles that have been assigned to men and to women. There have been parts that they've each had to play. Women, for example, were always going to be the ones to give birth. That's one example. Men were always going to be the ones to impregnate the women. That sounds very clinical, but there we go. We'll go with it.
So they all had different roles. They all had different parts they had to play in God's dominion purposes for creation. But we see now the woman's desires contrary to the husband's, not for the husband. And we see the husband rules over her. And the language there is not of them together having dominion over creation, but of the man having dominion over the woman, ruling over her even in a brutal way. What we see here, I believe, is the emergence of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. To say toxic masculinity is not to say, and this is what some, I'm not going to pull punches on this, I have only 30 minutes, I have to be sharp. Some who have a reading comprehension problem or a listening skills problem say, oh, you're claiming that masculinity is toxic. And they push back against that. Even good people who have a biblical understanding of Scripture and of men and women will push back against the language of toxic masculinity because in their mind, the way they're comprehending it is masculinity is toxic. And I understand that there are some people who do use the term in that way, and I would say they don't understand what they're talking about either. It is not to say femininity is toxic. What's interesting is those who deny such a thing as toxic masculinity, I have seen, have no issue calling out people for toxic femininity. In fact, there was a fellow, I don't even remember who, sorry if he's in this room or watching, but there was a guy who loaded my Facebook feed with posts about women doing bad things, hashtag toxic femininity. This is after some very strong denials of such a thing as toxic masculinity. So, honestly, we need to grow up a bit and have a serious conversation about these things. There is masculinity that is toxic. There is femininity that is toxic. When men point to women and say toxic femininity while saying toxic masculinity doesn't exist, they're doing what Adam did. They're walking in the steps of their father. When women say toxic masculinity, men are toxic, masculinity is toxic, and you have some sort of, pink-haired, nose-ringed woman screaming in the streets at random dudes walking by, then you have, you have someone, I think, that you need to be understanding of and sensitive of. They're not well, okay? You should share the gospel with them. You should love them. Let's resist the urge to politicize things and, get in a yelling match with that person. Although I feel the pull very strongly at times. Masculinity and femininity are given by God. They are not intrinsically toxic, but they have become toxic by sin, by the fall. And every one of us is affected. Every one of us has toxic traits in our masculinity and in our femininity. Toxic masculinity and toxic femininity are simply ways of communicating specific manifestations of these traits. And indeed, distortions of them. That to say, for example, that toxic water exists. There is such a thing as toxic water, right? There's a film I'm hoping to catch maybe later called Dark Waters, and I'm gathering, just based on the trailer, it's about toxic water. There's such a thing. To say that there is such a thing as toxic water is not to say that all water is in fact toxic. So there is such a thing as true masculinity, as true femininity. But here in this text, we're not really seeing that. The woman sees, she likes, she takes, she eats, she feeds her flesh. She goes with what she feels over what is real. She doubts the fairness of God. She denies the trustworthiness of holiness of God. She further denies her own value and worth. So for all the people who are screaming about toxic masculinity but not turning the spotlight on their own toxicity, are actually spiritually self-harming because they're not seeing that they are valuable and worthy as women. When you reject God's design, that's what you do. In this passage, I will say, don't see toxic masculinity in the brutish, rapey, barbaric sense, but we do see it in the boyish sense. I think that toxic masculinity can be some sort of grotesque brute on one side, but it also can be a silly boy on the other. And Adam's just sort of seems to be hanging out on the sidelines while his wife comes under profound spiritual attack. And she's given it to Adam, who is with her. And to be honest, those are the extremes I see in the men today, where you have brutes and you have boys, and you don't have men. But I want to open up another passage to illustrate toxic masculinity and femininity. Incidentally, it's not one of those that was given as an anchor text, so apologies to the team, but I think this will open things up nicely for us. Go to Esther chapter 1. And I'm going to try and summarize this quite neatly, but I would encourage you to read along with the thoughts that I'm saying so that you can find what I'm saying in the text. It's all there. Esther begins with a summary of Xerxes' greatness. Perhaps you have a translation that calls him Ahasuerus. That's what the Hebrews called him. Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia, Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. This summary of his greatness should not cloud our discernment. Xerxes' greatness was inseparable from his wickedness. He rules over an empire built on blood, the slaughter of masses across a significant portion of the known world at that time. The wealth and the riches that he was busy displaying for 180 days are his only by oppression, plunder, and theft, and a source, as we see, of great pride. But he's not satisfied. This feast that he's talking about, where there were there's a smaller feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden, white cotton curtains, violet hangings, cords of fine linen, purple, silver rods, marble pillars, couches of gold and silver, mosaic pavements of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones, drinks served in golden vessels, royal wine lavished according to the bounty of the king. Under the edicts there is no compulsion. Everyone is told to do as they desired. It's an orgiastic free-for-all, a rave. And this event, chaotic though it might seem, is in all probability part of the council planning his famed and ultimately failed invasion of Greece. He has everything, but it's not enough. I hope you're picking up a thread here. Adam and Eve in the garden had everything, but one thing. Or so they thought. And they had to have that one thing. They thought, if we have this one thing, we will be like God, but they forgot that they actually already were like God. They were made in His image. They traded all of the ways in which they were already like God for the one way in which they were not like God. And it was more than they could handle. And it destroyed us, the human race. In the text, there in Esther 1, we see some of the wrong beliefs of toxic humanity. Both men and women can be toxic. And at a heart level, the issues are very similar and indeed much the same. Cast your eyes over the text. See if you can spot them.
There's the idea that he was generous and good. And so he lavishes food and wine upon his people. And that's sort of window dressing to sort of appease people, to make them think that he's okay, to make them think he's right. I mean, it's classic dictator stuff. Give people enough.
Give people enough so that even when you're dead, people will still say nice things about you and be totally gaslit because you started an education program, or you provided food for needy people. Never mind, you massacred, slaughtered, brutalized, oppressed, enslaved, economically crippled. And all around the world, that's been the story throughout all of human history. And we are, all of us, at a small level in our own way, little dictators of our own spheres. He wants people to think he's generous and good while he plans the invasion of a country that's not hurting him at all. It's not even, there's no just war theory that can be applied to the invasion of Greece by Persia. He thinks that everything is well. He thinks that he is secure. He thinks that he is loved. Or he kids himself that he is secure. And he kids himself that he is loved. And again, that he is a really great guy. And what he says goes. And he's worthy. Meanwhile, his queen Vashti is giving a feast for the women in the palace. We read on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Probably an understatement. 7 days of drink. Yeah. He commanded a list of dudes that we won't bother to pronounce at this time. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And so the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So we move from wrong beliefs that he's the greatest, belief that all he has is his and is won by his own hand, righteously, belief that he is generous and good, belief that all is well, that he is secure, that he is loved, that he's a really great guy. And we move to wrong behaviors. And particularly in the text that we see here is drunkenness and the objectification of women. And rage, fury, when things don't go your way. Ahasuerus is married with wine, and he asks his wife to visit him. Some of the guys are like, well, what's so wrong with that? What's so wrong with, like a man asking him, he's just asking his wife to come and visit him and his mates. She's a toxic woman. This is toxic femininity. He's done with the man stuff now. He's turning the spotlight on the ladies in the room, right? And so we can relax a bit, and he's going to go after the women. Actually, I don't think Vashti's the bad person in this story. In fact, I think up until halfway through the book of Esther, when you actually have a change in Esther herself, I'll get to that, Vashti is the most virtuous woman that we read of in this book. Some translations illuminate the text in different ways. The Modern English Version says, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with the royal crown, to unveil her her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful. It's sort of euphemistic that we're adults, so we can just say it. He essentially wants Vashti to come to the palace and strip for his pals. That's the idea here. He's putting on a striptease with his wife, with his queen. Some scholars have said the way the language is put together in the text to come with her royal crown it has the sense, it conveys the sense of to appear wearing only her royal crown. The language of unveiling her beauty is pornographic. He wants them to gaze upon her in her nakedness. This is a sick individual. Even if you disagree with me, and I can take disagreement, it's fine. It's a trait of toxic masculinity when you can't handle disagreement. But he's objectifying. He's objectifying his wife, even if she's fully clothed. It's not about Vashti, it's about her beauty. It's not, I want you to see my wife and see what a noble woman she is and what a fine queen she is and how worthy she is of respect and how she bears the image of God and how she reflects the finest traits even in me, her husband, and how she is my glory, but rather it's, isn't she hot to look at? Francis E.W. Harper was a 19th century abolitionist and author. She wrote a poem that imagines the scenario. "Go tell the king," Vashti proudly said, "that I am Persia's queen, and by his crowds of merry men I never will be seen. I'll take the crown from off my head and tread it neath my feet. Before their rude and careless gaze, my shrinking eyes shall meet. A queen, unveiled before the crowd, upon each lip my name. Why, Persia's women all would blush and weep for Vashti's shame. Go back," she cried, and waved her hand, and grief was in her eye. "Go tell the king," she sadly said, "that I would rather die." How do you think that went over with the king? He's drunk. He's with his mates. They're egging one another on. He's already been talking about his wife in this sort of gross way. It doesn't go over well. He calls in his wise men. The wise men tell him basically what he wants to hear. According to the law, verse 15, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Nebuchadnezzar said in the presence of the king, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. And so he says at the conclusion of verse 18, there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. In other words, the women are going to rise up, and they're going to give us their version of the treatment we've been giving them for so long. What we see here is confirmation bias on both parts. The king asks counselors for advice. They tell him what he wants to hear, what they want to hear. The counselors know that Vashti's behavior will set a precedent that could lead to other people's marital relationships spiraling out of control. And I think what might at the beginning be seen by us as a positive feminist act. I have dignity, I should be respected, I will not be a showpiece, I will not be abused, I will not be objectified. They think will be seized upon to create a negative movement of resent and rebellion, whereby women neglect doing things that maybe they should be doing. So the resentful and rebellious women will harm the men, and this doesn't have any good, none of this has a good outcome. The resentful, rebellious women harm the men, thus creating more harm to women as the men become resentful and lash back, to which the women will respond, and the cycle repeats itself in a fashion totally disrespectful of God's good design for male and female roles, but totally consistent with the warring of men and women with each other since man first sinned. So, running out of time, cut it short, they got rid of Vashti. Some traditions say she was simply let go, some that she was kept in the harem, but never to be respected or loved again, others that she was killed. And the poem that I read a moment ago concludes, she left the palace of the king, proud of her spotless name, a woman who could bend to grief, but would not bow to shame. Are there any conversations in our cultural moment that run parallel to this text? #MeToo. Conversations about toxic masculinity. That is the emphasis at the moment because of all of the exposés of rape, sexual abuse. That has created, sometimes I question the motive, sometimes it's a pushback, a deflective pushback, but sometimes it's also raising important questions about men who are being sexually abused, and they're embarrassed and ashamed by that. They don't really know how to handle it. The things that men will go to prison for doing to women, men won't even report, they won't even whisper it, they're just, There are people in my church, men who have been raped. I know that's weird to think of. Teenage boys seduced by middle-aged women and sexually abused, and it scarred them to this day.
Other things that are less popular to talk about in our society: drunkenness. 7.8 million binge drinkers in the UK. And no one is immune to that. In fact, it's actually those who earn over £40,000 who are more likely to be frequent and binge drinkers than the low earners. The low earners are the visible ones. They're the ones you see on the street corner, slumped over on a bench or hunkered down over a table in the Wetherspoons. But behind the closed doors of Hampstead, there are people that are giving themselves wholly to alcohol.
I can't leave without talking about pornography. Whenever I mention it, someone says, "Oh, this is never talked about in our churches." I know that cannot be said of my church, because I make a regular point to at least mention it when I have the slightest excuse to. Because people are, I was about to say they're fighting it, or that they're wrestling with it. I'm not so sure that they're fighting it. I'm not so sure that they're wrestling with it. They're giving themselves to it. They're choosing it. One site in one day may have as many as 16 million users. Streamed 1.5 to 2 billion times a month. And I don't draw any distinctions when it comes to the ethics of pornography. All porn is wrong for a Christian. It's adultery of the heart. But there's this thing called abuse porn. And abuse porn averages over 60 million combined hits per month. More, if we're looking at U.S. statistics, and these things have influence here as well, more than the NBA, the NFL, Fortune magazine, Disney, NBC News combined. People checking out sites where they get a rise out of women being beaten, or sex acts being performed until the woman throws up, or there's blood all over everything. It's sick and twisted and wicked. 97% of Christian men have confessed to seeing porn. 79% of 18 to 30-year-old Christian men say they have viewed porn monthly. 37% have said they view it several times a week. It averages out between 9 and 10 years old when they first see it. In this text, it's not a stretch to say that the crisis Xerxes' counselors envision is a negative societal repercussion of drunkenness and the objectification and exploitation of women. So before we get too upset about the shrill women that we see on our Twitter and Facebook and maybe in the streets, we might think, what has happened to them to make them this way? We might try for a moment to contemplate what sins have been perpetuated in our society that have driven a backlash of toxic femininity. And so for the men in the room, that requires us to look at ourselves, men, and see, what have we done to create this, to cause this? And what can we do to address it? There's a lot more I'd like to say. But I want to see true masculinity just by reading a text, if we may. 1 Peter chapter 3. Could someone find that? And when you do, stand and read it, please. 1 Peter chapter 3. Verses 1 through 7. This is not toxic masculinity and femininity. This is true masculinity, true femininity, created in the image and likeness of Jesus Christ.
First Peter chapter 3, from verse 1 to 7. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. But when you observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, and putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women trusted in God and also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Husbands, likewise, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife, as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, and your praise may not be hindered.
Heirs together of the grace of life, strong women who don't fear anything that's frightening, and are at the same time loving and respectful and patient toward their husbands. Men who aren't deflecting about their wives' problems, but they're understanding, and they're trying to minister to and love their wife and minister to her. We've seen a toxic marriage in Xerxes and Vashti. That's a true marriage. That's true masculinity and femininity. Contra some protests, as I've said, there is such a thing as toxic masculinity and femininity. It is masculinity and femininity outside of God's created design, apart from Christ and opposed to Christ-likeness, totally, radically affected in every part by sin, fallen from relationship to God, and unawakened to redemption by grace. As someone who believes that humanity is totally and radically affected in every part of being by sin, I have no problem as a Christian affirming that there are fallen, twisted, unregenerate, and indeed toxic versions of masculinity and femininity that pervert God's design and take us away from biblical, holy, and healthy, God-given roles and responsibilities between men and women to the pelvic-thrusting barbarianism of cultural machismo and the backlash that creates. Even as toxic masculinity and femininity is real, there is such a thing as transformed true masculinity. Man as he was made to be. Woman as she was made to be. Created in the image of God and redemptively recreated by grace through faith in the likeness of Christ to love and good works. I hope that this has at least gotten the wheels turning in our minds and that we're able to discuss now what's going on in the Scriptures and how this relates to our society.